In this video, I'd like to continue talking about the historical evolution of the Spanish language as it came from Latin. And in previous videos, some of the changes that I gave you were kind of general changes. They were ones that happened in all Romance languages to a degree. And as we go further along in this evolution of the Spanish language, we're going to start seeing sound shifts and changes that only happen in Spanish and that don't happen in other Romance languages. So as this is the fourth video that I've done about Spanish, we're going to see today some words that shift in a way that is very unique to the Spanish language. And I'm going to show you how those words compare to other Romance languages and how those sounds shifted in a different way when coming from Latin. One thing that happens in Spanish that I find very curious is the way in which it kind of alters inherited words from the Latin language. For example, if I have these consonant clusters in Latin like kta or mna or pta, oftentimes in Romance languages, in all the main Romance languages that I know of, these consonant clusters, they become simplified. So to say a pta or a mna or a kta, those sounds are pretty infrequent in the Romance languages. The same thing happened in Spanish, where words like perfectum in Latin became perfecto in Spanish, or words like acto, like act in Latin, became atto in Spanish. But there was a kind of artificial attempt to show the Latin origins of the word. So at some point in the Middle Ages or early Renaissance, people started adding these letters back into the Spanish language. So that's why you have words like in Spanish like perfecto, which oftentimes people won't pronounce the C very, very strongly, but it is still there in the spelling. And whereas when we look at other Romance languages, we have perfeito in Portuguese, we have perfetto in Italian, and we have parfait in French. So we can see all those kta sounds have been erased in the main Romance languages. This is something also that happens in English that I find very curious. For example, a word like debt in English is spelled with a B. It's an inherited word from French, and I believe in Old English it was spelled D-E-T-T-E, like debt. So the BT consonant cluster had already faded out in English, but I think in the 14, 15, 1600s, educated people or monks who were the people that wrote at the time, they wanted to show how these words had Latin origins. So the word for debt or O in Latin is debeo. So since that has a B sound, they added the B back in, except in English, nobody changed the way the word was pronounced. So that's why we have debt with a B, even though the B is not pronounced at all. It's been pronounced more or less the same way for the past, few centuries or so. And this is a situation where Portuguese and Italian, they do not have this kind of, these consonant clusters. They eliminate them, where in Italian they become double consonants usually, and then in Portuguese they simplify it into a single consonant, eliminating usually the first consonant sound. But in French and Romanian, they do have these consonant clusters preserved in a lot of environments. So it's interesting to see that even though Portuguese and Spanish are the most similar in terms of evolution, that Portuguese does not have these consonant clusters and Spanish does, because Spanish went and re-added the consonants at a later point in time due to some kind of like scholarly desire to show the language how it related to Latin. So if we look at a verb like acceptare in Latin, we can see how this pta sound is realized differently in those different languages. In Portuguese I have aceitar, in Spanish I have aceptar, but that P sound again was added at a later point in time. So in Old Spanish, it probably would have been something like aceitar. In French, I have accepter, which that pta sound remains. In Italian, I have accettare, so the pta sound becomes a double consonant. There's a stop there where the P kind of used to be. And then in Romanian, I have accepta, which again, we can see that pta consonant cluster existing in Romanian. Let's take a look at another example with a consonant cluster, and let's take a look at this kta sound. So in a Latin word like effectus, we have this kta sound. Again, we can see that the pattern kind of works the same way, where in Portuguese we have efeito, in Spanish we have efecto, but again, that k sound was added at a later point in time. In French we have effet, So we can see that k sound is actually gone. So when these consonant clusters become simplified or not is something that happens sometimes in French and not in other environments. In Italian, I have effetto. So again, there's that double T sound where the consonant cluster used to be. And then in Romanian, I have the word effect. We can see in Romanian that those consonant clusters are preserved in a lot of environments. The conservation of these complex consonant clusters from Latin to Spanish is not something that happens uniformly by any means. And we can see in a lot of situations that the inherited word does take precedence over the relearned word that does include the consonant clusters from Latin. For example, if I take a word in Latin like ready, which is promptus. So this word for ready in Latin, it is promptus, promptus. So there's 3 consonants there. We have mt, which is a pretty complex consonant cluster for people to make. And we can see how people that are speaking a language would kind of simplify that naturally over time because it takes a lot to enunciate a kind of mt sound. So this word promptus in Latin, in Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese, we all have pronto, pronto. So that mt sound became an n. In French, I have the word prompt, or I can have prompt, depending on the pronunciation of the person in question. So the P is written, but not everybody is going to pronounce it depending on their accent. They might say prompt, or they might say prompt. If you watch my last videos, you'll remember that I referred to a term called syncope. Syncope is when there is an unstressed vowel that is deleted in the middle of a word. And we can see when these consonant clusters occur due to syncope, they actually, instead of becoming simplified, become vowels. So we can see again in a lot of words in Spanish that there's a kind of insertion of a glide or a vowel that gets put in where a consonant previously was. For example, if I look at a word like city in Spanish, the word for city in Spanish is ciudad. So it's ciudad. Whereas in Portuguese I have cidade. So there's no kind of U sound in there. In Italian, I have città. In French, I have cité. In Romanian, I have cetate. So we can see how all those words, they stem from the Latin word for city, which is civitate. And this is the cause of those words in Spanish that have a ch sound, where other languages don't have a sound that's similar to that. Because if I have a word in Latin like noctem, which means night, and then I have noite, if this t sound becomes soft enough, or it becomes palatized enough, I should say, it can shift into a ch sound over time. So that's why I have in Spanish a word like noche, whereas I have in Portuguese noite, which that's just Brazilian pronunciation actually, and in Portugal I think it would be something like noite. In French I have nuit, in Italian I have notte, and then in Romanian I have noapte. So we can actually see that this shift from k to p is something that happens in Romanian. It's very interesting, and if I learn more about Romanian, I'll try to talk about that in future videos. One thing that I also find kind of uniquely Spanish, and this is useful if you already know a Romance language and you're trying to recognize a word in Spanish, is the shift from fuzz in initial sounds in Latin to this silent sound in Spanish, which is often spelt with an H. So this f sound became softened over time into a h sound, and then eventually became so soft that it disappeared completely. But that is why we have these silent H's written in Spanish in words like hablar, hecho, hacer, okay? So oftentimes we can see in languages that spellings can remain static sometimes, whereas pronunciation shifts. So unless you update your spelling to reflect the new pronunciation, there might be a large discrepancy between pronunciation and spelling. And we can see that in English, right? A lot of words are spelled in a historical manner, but the pronunciation can be very different from how they are spelled. So this is something that's useful to know, because if I speak another Romance language and I come across a word in Spanish like hacer, then I can probably infer that that is a f sound in the other Romance languages. And that would be correct, because the Latin word facere, which means to do, it becomes hacer in Spanish, fazer in Portuguese, it becomes faire in French, it becomes fare in Italian, and in Romanian I have face. Another good word that could exist as an example is the word filius in Latin, which means son, like son as in father and son. In Portuguese, I have filho. In Spanish, I have hijo. In French, I have fils. In Italian, I have figlio. And then in Romanian, I have fiu. So Spanish is very unique in this regard in that these sounds, they are all fuzz in other Romance languages, but they become silent sounds in Spanish. It should also be noted that words that actually started with an H sound in Latin, they also became silent H sounds in Spanish as well. So both F became a silent H and both H became a silent H. There's no distinction between the two of those sounds in modern Spanish. So I hope that you enjoyed this video, and even more so than that, I hope that if you're somebody that's learning Spanish, or if you're somebody that speaks Spanish learning another Romance language, that some of these sound shifts that I displayed are able to help you make educated guesses when you come across words that might be unfamiliar, and to equate them back into your own Romance language or a Romance language that you know. So I'm coming to the end of the main points of historical Spanish that I wanted to discuss. And once I'm done, I'm going to take words from Romance languages and compare them to one another to show you how these rules kind of work, and to do a kind of analysis of these words in the Romance languages to see how they relate to one another. So thank you for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. And to see more videos from me every Friday, subscribe to my YouTube channel, Mappamundi Languages.